Fellow travelers of time, close your eyes and let your soul hear the echoes of the past. Through the dim mists of the Middle Ages, where steel clashed with steel, where blood sank into the earth like vows that could never be broken, men entered the arena not merely to survive, but to defend the most fragile of treasures: honor. A contemptuous glance, a mocking word, even something as trivial as a piece of smoked meat in a roadside inn. Each could ignite the spark of a duel, where life and death were sealed by the final strike of a blade. Yet, behind these mortal combats lay more than blood and iron. They were the chronicles of humanity itself, of pride and defiance, of justice and its absurd shadows. And tonight, we embark on this journey to hear the echo of swords ring out from the depths of history, and to behold our own reflection in the blood-stained mirror of the past. If this story moves you, we invite you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Each gesture helps drops of origin continue to cast light upon the forgotten corridors of history, where memory endures beyond time. So now, let us cross the gates of centuries into the arena where justice, honor, and fate converge into a tragic epic. And our first tale begins in France, in the year 1386, the final duel of an empire.
In the grand tapestry of medieval Europe, there were threads of honor, courage, and unwavering commitment to justice. Amidst the clash of steel, the rumble of war drums, and the solemn oath of knighthood, there lived a woman named Marguerite. Her life was about to change dramatically, not on a battlefield, but within the four walls of her home. One fateful day, a sinister shadow fell over her peaceful existence. Her world turned upside down. She found herself trapped in a nightmare. Her attackers, Jacques Legris, a courtier of the French king, Charles VI, and his accomplices. Her tormentors violated every boundary of human decency, shattering her dignity and leaving her traumatized. The details of the assault were so harrowing that they still send shivers down our spines today. Marguerite's ordeal did not end with that dark night. No, her agony was far from over. In a society where a woman's honor was inextricably linked to her virginity, she became a symbol of shame and her reputation was tarnished beyond repair. Desperate for justice, she turned to her husband, Jean de Carouge, a valiant knight with a strong sense of honor. Jean was a man of action, a warrior who had seen his fair share of battles. However, the battlefield was one thing, but fighting for justice in the court of King Charles VI was quite another. Here, cunning and deception often triumphed over brute force. As he navigated the labyrinthine corridors of power, Jean realized that he was up against formidable opponents who spared no effort in their attempts to silence him. Jean's determination only grew stronger. He refused to back down in the face of these powerful enemies. With his honor and the very essence of justice at stake, he was prepared to go to any lengths to expose the truth. Jean was fortunate to find an ally in the most unexpected of places, Odette de Champtibus, the queen's advisor. Recognizing the gravity of the situation and the urgent need for justice, Oda set aside her initial doubts and threw her considerable influence behind Marguerite and Jean's cause. With Oda's support, Jean's voice echoed louder within the royal court. People began to pay attention to his desperate pleas for justice, but the road to justice was still fraught with peril. King Charles VI, influenced by the cunning courtiers, saw this case as a mere opportunity to test his power. He was determined to manipulate the situation to his advantage, all while feigning impartiality. As the king prepared to make his judgment, the entire court held its breath. Would justice prevail or would evil triumph? In a shocking turn of events, King Charles VI ruled in favor of Jacques Legris, branding Carouge as a liar and sentencing him to death by the sword. Devastated by the king's unjust verdict, Carouge found himself on the brink of death. All hope seemed to be lost. But amidst the gloom, a glimmer of defiance flickered. Carouge, refusing to accept his fate, boldly called for a trial by combat. He was confident in his own strength and saw it as his last chance to prove his wife's innocence and expose the treachery of Jacques Legris. His supporters rallied around him, determined to stand by him in his darkest hour. The news of the upcoming trial spread like wildfire, igniting the public's interest. People from all walks of life flocked to the scene, eager to witness the dramatic showdown. As the day of the trial approached, tension gripped the kingdom. Everyone knew that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a clash between truth and lies, honor and deceit, and ultimately, life and death. And then it happened. The trial by combat that would determine not only Karu's fate, but also the very fabric of justice in the kingdom. The two knights entered the arena, each representing a different side of the justice they were about to deliver. The crowd watched intently as the trial commenced. With bated breath, every move, every parry and thrust was scrutinized. The outcome of this trial was not just about winning a battle. It was about upholding the principles of justice, honor and truth. Who will emerge victorious? Will it be Courageous, the valiant knight seeking justice for his wife, or Legris, the cunning courtier backed by the king? Only time would tell. The trial raged on, and with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. The crowd roared, their cheers echoing the hopes and fears that pounded in their chests. It was a spectacle that transcended the boundaries of a mere trial, becoming a symbol of the struggle between good and evil. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the arena, the outcome of the trial remained uncertain. The tension was palpable, and the spectators were on the edge of their seats. Suddenly, in a heart-stopping moment, Courageous disarmed Legris, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Victory seemed within reach, but Legris, desperate to avoid defeat, made a final plea. He challenged Courageous to a one-on-one sword duel, promising that he would confess to the crime if he lost. Courageous, driven by his desire for justice and the chance to clear his wife's name, accepted the challenge. The crowd watched in suspense as the two knights faced off, their swords flashing in the afternoon sun. The final confrontation was intense, and the crowd's cheers and gasps filled the air. The outcome of the duel would not only determine their fates, but also shape the course of justice in the kingdom. Who will emerge victorious in this ultimate test of skill and courage? Will Courageous triumph and bring justice to his wife, or will Legris prevail and escape the consequences of his actions? The answer hung in the balance, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats. The battle was fierce, but in the end, Courageous emerged victorious, his sword raised high in the air. The crowd erupted in cheers, hailing him as a hero. Legris, defeated and ashamed, confessed to his crimes, bringing a semblance of justice to Marguerite. However, the scars of that fateful night would forever remain etched in her memory. Part 2. The darkest gladiator of the French kingdom. What kind of stories can be invented about fights between knights during the siege of 1294 in the English city of Calais? When ordinary soldiers clashed, there was nothing unusual. You get weapons, you fight, and maybe you die. But the climax of those battles was something else entirely. History remembers two fighters, the young knight Gauvin de Buell and the English noble Thomas de Brotherton. Their duel went beyond the usual context of war. These were personal accounts. You can't call it anything but hatred. Those clashes were not just part of someone's order. This was a settling of scores, man to man, weapon to weapon. This was real martial arts. However, when archaeologists discovered the skeletons of these warriors 700 years later, they realized that the story of the duel had a different ending than what the chronicles told. The fighters did not die from wounds sustained in battle, but both had their heads cut off. They did not die during the clash, but died separately from the battle. Therefore, there must have been a reason for this, because such acts were not uncommon during the Middle Ages. The Vikings used to put the heads of their slain enemies on pikes. This was a symbol of power and a warning to other enemies, and the executioner's axe had a tradition of being dipped into the blood of the defeated king. The executions were meant to scare the subjects and instill respect, and at the end of the 13th century, the French were executing royal prisoners. To understand how things were going, let's take a look at how the duel between Gavin and Thomas might have gone. Battle on the eve of dismemberment. For 4 months, the British and Gascons fought around Calais. No quarter was given or asked. On September 8, 1294, the French decided to attack the English fortifications. Around noon, while the siege was reaching its peak, two knights, Gavin and Thomas, met in the middle of the battlefield. Both were furious and evenly matched. The battle raged for hours, accompanied by screams and shouts. According to legend, the knights fought so fiercely that their weapons broke. Gavin was seriously wounded. Then, seeing Thomas fall, he finished him off with a dagger. However, history tells us that they both survived, although the victory remained with Gavin. During the siege, everything was allowed, but after the battle, both sides needed to bury the dead, including their own soldiers. Most often, these were not official burials, but simply bodies dumped into ditches outside the city walls. In addition, the corpses were desecrated by dogs, scavengers, and the elements. Thus, finding intact skeletons of medieval warriors is extremely rare, so the archaeologists had to use all the available data to reconstruct the events of the past. According to historical documents, Gawain and Thomas did not die in battle, which means they were executed separately. Moreover, the skeleton of Thomas was found without a head, and next to him was an axe. That was the weapon of executioners. As for Gavin, his skeleton was also missing its head, but nearby was a sword. In other words, the knight was beheaded, not with an axe. The answer was found unexpectedly far from the battlefield. In the same castle that served as a base for the executioners of Queen Isabella, the executioners cut off the heads of the knights, probably after the battle, perhaps to make an example of them. And then they tossed the severed heads over the city wall, so that they would end up outside the settlement. The archaeological excavations confirmed this version. The execution site itself was quite close to the city, but the heads could have been carried much further by water running down from the hill. It turned out that both knights died in completely different places. Thomas was definitely killed after he lost the battle, but Gavin could have been executed immediately after the duel. There is no way to know for sure, so the mystery remains unsolved. The only thing we can say for certain is that both men died painfully and unnecessarily, but the main thing is that their skulls ended up in the same place. The archaeologist happened to find them together. Thus, the skeletons of the warriors finally found peace after a violent death. Now they rest in the same cemetery. One can only guess what these knights would have thought about it, considering their fierce battle. Nevertheless, the discovery was significant not only for French history, but also for science. After all, every new find brings researchers closer to understanding the era in which people fought differently, but also died in the same way. Part 1. The Duel of Champions in the Mud of Normandy on August 25, 1202. A terrible battle took place in Normandy. Two knights went down in history, but not because of their victories, but because of their deaths. Those warriors had names: William de Ypres and Walter de Sully. Their confrontation was a culmination, a battle of champions. And although the outcome was decided in minutes, the preparation for it lasted for months. The chronicles of those distant times tell a story that sounds almost like a modern press conference before a championship match. The reputation of both knights was at stake, and the whole of northern France watched with bated breath who would emerge victorious from that confrontation. First of all, they chose the date and the location of the duel. This was important, because both knights wanted to show themselves in the best possible light. They agreed on the day of St. Bartholomew and the location near the town of Lincoln. The ground there was soft, the weather was supposed to be good, and most importantly, both knights could get there easily. The challenge was accepted, and then rumors spread throughout the country. As always happens before a big fight, people argued endlessly, trying to predict the outcome. A huge crowd gathered at the appointed place. Medieval France was full of people who liked to watch something extraordinary, so the public was ready. The knights came, a short truce sounded, and then the first blows were dealt. The chronicles say it happened quickly. Within minutes, both riders fell to the ground, but whose victory was it? History has preserved very little information, only that, in that battle, neither knight raised his head again. Only a few spectators witnessed the clash, and they did not agree on the outcome. Some shouted that William de Ypres was the winner. Others claimed the opposite. Decades passed, and the dispute continued. Some chroniclers of those times, trying to make sense of the confusion, said that both knights died simultaneously. It is unlikely that anyone will ever know the truth. Moreover, if the fight was interrupted by death, who really won? Perhaps this was a draw. And yet, despite the lack of accurate information, historians managed to shed light on this event. After all, duels were not uncommon in medieval Europe, but they were usually accompanied by a lot of hype. Even if the fight didn't go according to plan, there were always witnesses, chroniclers, and most importantly, there was something to brag about afterward. In the case of Williams and Walter, however, everything is different. The reports of the battle were contradictory and confused. Moreover, there were no winners. All this indicates that the duel was not a simple competition, but had tragic consequences. The knights probably entered the fight fully armed, and this made it incredibly difficult to move in the thick armor. Despite the fact that the ground was soft, it quickly turned into a swampy mess. In such conditions, hardly anyone could demonstrate their skills, and the lack of witnesses proves that it wasn't a regular duel. Instead, it was a trap, an ambush. Someone pushed the knights, knowing that the ground would swallow them along with their horses. They struggled, fell, and never got up again. Who set this trap? Unfortunately, history is silent. But the mention of such events made it clear that this was not an accident, but a deliberately organized provocation. During the Middle Ages, there were no rules for martial arts, so the duel could be interrupted at any moment. A knight could be attacked from behind, struck with a club, or simply pushed into the mud. Moreover, if the knight fell, his opponent could deliver a fatal blow right there. Of course, there were condemnations, but what punishment could be expected for a crime like that? Nothing. And the rumor about the shameful death of the knights could subside within a couple of decades. In this case, however, the chroniclers tried to figure out who exactly had provoked the duel. They had their suspicions, but they never reached a consensus, and that story remained a legend. The silence of history is sometimes deceptive. It may seem that the wars and battles of those times were brutal and senseless. That was true, but sometimes even death could become a plot twist. Today we will talk about the first night of the Romans. This will be the third episode of our series of videos about the most important events of human history. Stay till the end and we will start our lecture. In this episode, we will discuss the battle that many historians consider to have changed the course of Europe's history. We are talking about the Battle of Carensabis, which took place on August 11, 451. At that time, the Western Roman Empire was already in decline, and the Huns under the leadership of Attila had been terrorizing its lands for several decades. The Huns were originally a nomadic tribe from Central Asia who migrated to Europe in the 4th century. They were fierce warriors, highly skilled in horseback riding and archery, and were known for their terrifying war cries. As they swept across Europe, the Huns caused panic among the local populations, leaving behind them a trail of destruction and devastation. Their leader, Attila, also known as the Scourge of God, was feared throughout the continent. In 451, Attila and his army invaded Gaul, the Roman province that today includes much of France. The Romans, led by Itius, a general of Pannonian origin, assembled an army to resist the Hunnic invasion. Among them were soldiers from various Germanic tribes allied with Rome, such as the Burgundians, Alemanni, and Saxons, as well as a contingent of Visigoths led by their king, Theodoric I. Despite being outnumbered, the Roman army managed to ambush the Huns near the town of Carensabis. The battle was fierce. The Romans used their traditional tactics of the late empire, relying on infantry and cavalry armed with swords and spears. However, the Huns, with their superior mobility, managed to avoid direct confrontation. They used their bows and arrows to harass the Roman troops and then fled before the enemy could react. Throughout the day, the battle continued without any side being able to achieve a decisive victory. The Romans held firm, but the Huns proved to be relentless. As the sun began to set, a sudden change occurred. According to the accounts of the chroniclers, a large number of Visigoths, led by King Theodoric I, abandoned the Roman ranks and joined the Huns. The reasons for this defection are unclear, but it is believed that Theodoric was influenced by his wife, Honzova of Hunnic origin, who wanted to reunite with her people. With the arrival of the Visigoths, the balance of power shifted and the Roman forces were pushed back. Aetius and his troops retreated to a hill where they made a final stand, but soon they began to run out of ammunition and the situation looked bleak. Meanwhile, Attila, confident of his imminent victory, decided to finish off the Romans. He led a final assault, ordering his troops to attack without mercy. But suddenly, according to a detail recorded by the chronicler Jordanes, a torrential rain began to fall, turning the battlefield into a muddy swamp. The Huns, used to fighting on open plains, were caught off guard by the sudden change in terrain. Their horses struggled to stay upright in the mud, and their bows and arrows became useless. The rain also put an end to the fighting spirit of the Romans, allowing them to regroup and defend themselves. The rest of the night passed without major incidents. With the first rays of dawn, both armies realized the battle had become unfair. The Romans, though exhausted and demoralized, had managed to survive. The Huns, hindered by the unfavorable terrain and the lack of clarity in the darkness, had lost their momentum. So it was agreed that both sides would withdraw from the battlefield with their remaining troops. The Romans, despite having lost the battle, had managed to fulfill their objective of stopping the Hunnic advance. The Huns, although victorious, had not achieved the decisive victory they desired. After the battle, Attila continued his campaign through Gaul, but soon returned to Pannonia. The Western Roman Empire survived the Hunnic invasion, but the Battle of Carensabis marked a turning point in its history. The abandonment of the Visigoths, who had been part of the Roman army, symbolized the growing estrangement between the Germanic peoples and Rome. These tribes, once integrated into the imperial military structure, now preferred to ally themselves with external enemies rather than remain subjected to Roman rule. The battle also showed the limitations of the Western Roman army, which, despite its numerical superiority, could not defeat the Huns due to its inability to adapt to new combat methods. After the battle, the figure of Attila the Hun continued to grow in legend and terror. He died in 453 during his wedding night, possibly due to a nosebleed or a head wound suffered in battle. When news of his death reached Rome, Pope Leo the Great organized a solemn thanksgiving. Although history remembers Attila as a cruel and ruthless conqueror, it is possible that his legacy would have been even more devastating had he lived longer. This episode was quite important, but unfortunately very little is known about it because in those times, only big battles were recorded. Most people could neither read nor write, and even less so women. Due to this, thousands of events that could have been very important but did not involve great rulers went undocumented. Many historians believe that this may have been the case with the existence of Rome's first night watchmen. Today, whenever we walk around at night, we do so safely, thanks to the fact that there are policemen patrolling the streets to maintain order. However, this system was not implemented until the Middle Ages, when night watchmen appeared in the main European cities, and Rome was no exception. The truth is that we don't know exactly who the first night watchman was, since no written record exists of it. The earliest references we have date back to the 9th century, during the reign of Pope Nicholas III, when 2 watchmen were hired to patrol the dark streets of Rome at night. One of the most accepted hypotheses suggests that these watchmen were part of the papal guards. According to tradition, the first official police force in Rome was created in 860 by Pope Nicholas III to protect him during his walks around the city. The rumors claim that a plot had been hatched against him, and although nothing came of it, he decided to keep his personal guard. Little by little, more men were added to this guard, until it became a body of 200 Swiss mercenaries that patrolled the entire city. It was even rumored that the secret service of the Pope existed since the time of Gregory VII, who reigned from 590 to 605 AD. This secret service was responsible for warning the pontiff of any plots against his life. So it is likely that the night watchman arose from this same papal guard, evolving to take on the function of protecting citizens from crime and maintaining public order. However, there's another hypothesis that points to a rather curious origin for the first night watchman. According to this theory, the inspiration came from a nightmare that Pope Nicholas III had. In his dream, he saw Rome engulfed in flames with citizens being persecuted by demons. When he woke up, he was so shaken by the vision that he immediately ordered the creation of a corps of night watchmen to guard over the city while he slept peacefully in the Vatican. Which of these two theories do you think might be true? Tell us your opinion in the comments. It is important to note that the role of night watchmen in medieval Rome was not easy. They had to deal with beggars, drunks, prostitutes, thieves, and all kinds of people who disturbed the peace of the night. They also faced danger, as they were frequently attacked by criminals and sometimes even had to fight to defend themselves. It was not uncommon for night watchmen to carry simple weapons like clubs or maces to defend themselves against attackers. Another interesting fact was that the night watchmen were often volunteers. The early watchmen were generally volunteers who received no pay for their services. They were typically members of the local militia or other civic organizations who volunteered to serve as watchmen during their free time. Over time, however, the position became more professionalized and night watchmen began to be hired full-time. Despite the challenges and dangers, the night watchmen played an essential role in maintaining order and security in medieval Rome. Their presence helped reduce crime and maintain public order, contributing to the tranquility of the city. The tradition of night watchmen in Rome lasted until the 19th century, when modern police forces were created to replace them. Today, the figure of the night watchman remains an iconic symbol of the city of Rome, evoking a time when these brave men patrolled the streets to protect its citizens. Rome's first watchmen were simple men, mostly ordinary citizens who volunteered to help maintain order and security in the city at night. They were not paid for their services and had to perform their duties in addition to their regular jobs. Despite the lack of pay and recognition, the night watchmen were vital to the city's security, helping to prevent crimes such as theft and vandalism and to maintain public order. Theirs was a thankless job, but essential for the good of the community. We hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe and click the bell icon to receive notifications about new videos. Leave a like if you liked the video and a comment with your opinion. And if you want to learn more about the history of Rome, check out our videos about the founding of Rome and the 7 hills of Rome. See you next time. If the previous battles were filled with blood and glory, then this one started from an ordinary breakfast. To be honest, it sounds a bit ridiculous, but in the Middle Ages, a knight's honor was so fragile that just a piece of bacon could make them go crazy. Let me explain. In those days, all roads led to Rome. The road from France to Italy was full of inns where travelers, merchants, and knights stopped for a bite to eat. The year is 1325. The places are small and near the town of Orleans. That morning, the air was warm with the smell of crackling wood fires, the sound of spoons tapping on wooden bowls, and the aroma of bacon wafting in the air. Our story revolves around a young French knight named Olivier de Clisson. He sat at a simple wooden table eating his breakfast. On the plate before him lay a generous helping of meat, bread, and light wine, a standard fare for a hungry traveler. But his peaceful meal didn't last long. At the next table sat a group of merchants who were loudly discussing their latest deals. Among them was a portly man in a green tunic, who had clearly seen better days. His name was Reginald de Bavara, and he was not a merchant, but a knight fallen on hard times, though he still clung fiercely to his honor and dignity. As Olivier brought a piece of meat, presumably bacon, to his mouth, Reginald loudly drawled, "Hey, that piece of meat looks more suited for a dog than a gentleman. It'd be better for someone with a big belly like yours." In truth, Olivier was far from being corpulent, but in the world of medieval chivalry, such jests were considered a direct attack on a knight's honor, and Olivier was quick to take offense. He slams his wine cup onto the table, making the liquid slosh over the edge. The cup fell to the ground and shattered. All eyes turned to Reginald. A hush fell over the room. No one dared to speak, for they knew what was going to happen next. Knights took their duels very seriously, and once challenged, refusing to fight was seen as the greatest dishonor one could face. So without hesitation, Reginald got up from his seat and grabbed a wooden stool. His beady eyes glinted with excitement. He had found a worthy opponent to test his skills against, and he wasn't going to back down. With that, he rushed outside. The two fighters met in the open field where a crowd of onlookers had gathered. For the most part, these were common folk, townspeople who had heard about the upcoming duel and come to watch. Some put money on Reginald, considering him the favorite. Others supported the young knight, seeing it as a battle between an old, disgraced knight and an innocent traveler. However, none of them could have guessed how the outcome would surprise them all. The duel began. Reginald lunged forward, swinging the stool with all his might. The crowd gasped as the weapon whistled through the air, narrowly missing Olivier's head. He stumbled backward, barely managing to dodge the blow. Despite the danger, he felt a thrill course through him. This was his first real fight, and though fear pricked at his heart, excitement overpowered it. As Reginald advanced again, Olivier decided to counter it. He struck out, aiming at Reginald's arm, but the older knight was prepared for this. With a grunt, he parried the blow, deflecting it with his free hand. The two continued fighting, and although Olivier was skilled, Reginald's experience and strength made him a tough opponent. The young knight was soon exhausted, his armor dented in several places, his sword nearly useless after Reginald's forceful strikes. Just as Olivier's strength was beginning to fail him and defeat loomed near, he remembered his training, the lessons his father, a famous knight, had taught him. Taking a deep breath, Olivier focused. He had nothing left to lose. Now or never, he thought, and charged forward. Reginald, taken aback by the sudden burst of energy, couldn't hold his ground. The stool slipped from his grasp and crashed to the ground. Before he could react, Olivier pressed his advantage, disarmed him, and pinned him to the ground. Reginald lay there, utterly defeated. He looked up at Olivier, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and shame, but Olivier showed no mercy. He tightened his grip, his eyes flashing with determination. He would not let go until his honor was satisfied, and so it ended. The onlookers, who had been watching intently, erupted in cheers. Some shouted Olivier's name, others cursed Reginald's defeat, but in the end, only one thing mattered. The young knight had defended his honor. He had won the duel, but even in victory, Olivier couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. A life had been broken for a piece of bacon, something that could have filled a hungry stomach in the morning. Yet such was the medieval code of conduct. A knight's honor was sacred, and if someone dared challenge it, they must be ready to face the consequences. And that is the story of how a knight lost his life for a piece of bacon. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. Until next time, the old knight adjusted his armor, the midday sun gleaming off its polished surface. A 1v1 fight. His squire stood beside him, polishing a sword until it shone like a mirror. That's right, lad, 1 against 1, just like the ancient Romans did. But sir, the young squire looked up at his knight with confusion. Aren't we supposed to, try to kill the other guy? The knight let out a deep sigh. Exactly what I'm talking about. Back in my day, a knight's honor was measured by his fighting skills. Now it's all about who can kill the other first. Back in my day, we fought for glory, for the love of fighting. Now it's just murder. He shook his head disapprovingly. Back in your day, sounds romantic. The squire grinned, unable to stop polishing his sword. All right, enough of this. Let's go kill someone. The knight suddenly grinned back. Just make sure you don't die before me, all right? My funeral will be expensive enough as it is, without having to pay for yours as well. The squire blushed and bowed his head back to his polishing. Yes, sir. The knight chucked and walked away. They soon arrived at the training yard where 2 knights awaited them. One of them wore the traditional white armor of the French, the other the green and red livery of England. It was clear who was who, though, because each of them had a flag bearing their country's emblem planted firmly in the ground beside them. Neither knight was particularly young, both of them bearing scars and dents in their armor that spoke of many hard-fought battles. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the only sound being the wind tugging at the flags. Then the Englishman spoke up. "Are you ready, old friend?" he asked with a grin. The Frenchman raised his sword. "Ready and willing to die," he replied with a sneer. The 2 knights charged forward, swords flashing in the sunlight. The English knight was fast and strong, his blade whistling through the air like a venomous snake. The French knight was more deliberate, parrying and lunging with controlled precision. The battle was long and hard-fought, neither knight gaining the upper hand. As they fought, the 2 knights traded insults and mockery, just like old friends. "Is that all you got, frog?" yelled the Englishman between gasps for breath. "At least I haven't pissed my britches, unlike some I could mention," retorted the Frenchman, which caused the Englishman to nearly lose his balance as he doubled over in laughter. Between bouts of swordplay, they reminisced about old times when they used to fight alongside each other, part of the same company of men-at-arms. They had been close friends until the outbreak of the war, when the King of France had given them the choice: leave the kingdom or die. They chose to fight. As the battle raged on, however, they began to tire. And so, with a sudden burst of energy, the Englishman managed to land a solid hit, knocking the French knight's sword out of his hand. For a moment, the Frenchman looked stunned, but then he did something unexpected. He threw his head back and laughed. "Well fought, old friend," he said, sheathing his sword. "You win this round." The Englishman stared at him in surprise. "What?" he asked, confused. "Didn't you want to kill me?" The Frenchman shrugged. "It's just a game, isn't it?" he said, smiling. "Besides, I wouldn't want to die any other way than by the blade of the best knight in Christendom." He held out his hand to the Englishman, who stared at it for a moment before grinning and clasping it tightly. "Best knight in Christendom, huh?" he said, laughing. "I think I'll take that as a compliment." And so, these two old friends, bound by honor and duty to fight against each other, decided instead to call a truce. Every day they met in the training yard to fight, to joke, to reminisce, and to remind themselves that even in the darkest of times, friendship and honor can shine through. And the bloody battle in the arena captivated all spectators, both commoners and nobles alike. Part 9. The Arena. If knights saw duels as a test of honor to the crowd, the arena took on a different meaning. A blood festival where the sound of steel and death became entertainment. Imagine a summer morning in the 14th century. The town is abuzz with people pouring into the square. Children sit on their parents' shoulders. Women jostle for space near the fence. Merchants shout to sell wine and cakes. The atmosphere is festive, but what they are waiting for is not song or dance, but a battle to the death. The trumpets blared. Two knights stepped forward, their armor gleaming, their faces hidden behind their helmets. The crowd roared, called names, placed bets. Some placed their bags of silver on the taller man. Others placed their trust in the younger knight with fiery eyes. No one cared about the truth of the case, about justice or reason. All they wanted was blood to be spilled today. The battle began. The clash of swords was deafening. Horses were neighing, and dust was flying everywhere. Every time a blow hit the armor, the crowd roared like crazy. When blood splattered, cheers rose. Mothers held their children high up in the air, as if to let them witness the justice of the times. People laughed, cheered, bet, and raised their glasses of wine while on the sand. Two lives were struggling between life and death. To the crowd, the knight was just a puppet in a show, a puppet that could collapse at any moment to satisfy their bloodlust. At times, the knight collapsed, unable to rise, but the audience roared, forcing him to continue, as if the pain was the most exciting part. Only when one of them died did the cheers reach their climax, a maniacal satisfaction, as if they had just witnessed a sacrifice. Justice, truth, all of that disappeared amid the screams. The arena became a stage, and blood was the script. The medieval crowd did not need reason. They needed the moment of steel-piercing flesh, the dying screams, the entertainment of death. The bloody battles in the arena captivated all spectators, both commoners and nobles alike. However, it was the common people who were the most frenzied. For them, the duel was not just a display of martial arts or a means of settling disputes. It was pure excitement. They had come to see blood spill, and they got their money's worth. It didn't matter whether their knight won or lost. What mattered was the spectacle, the clash of steel, the dust of the fight. This was their sport, their violent sport. Even children were brought to the square to watch these duels, desensitizing them to violence from an early age. Women, too, were present in large numbers. For them it was a chance to break the monotony of everyday life. The cheers, the excitement, the raw emotions on display. It was a break from the quiet world of domestic duties. The merchants saw an opportunity to make extra money. They sold food, drinks, and even souvenirs related to the event. And nobles, well, they enjoyed the show as much as anyone else. After all, what's a little bloodshed among equals? As the centuries passed, these tournaments became grander affairs, more participants, more spectators, and more at stake. The rules, too, became more codified. There were set times for the duels, the weapons used were decided beforehand, and there were even judges to ensure that the rules were followed. But despite all the organization, there was still an element of chance, of surprise, which kept the crowds coming back for more. Then came the day when the king decided that enough was enough. He put an end to the tournaments, outlawing them in the kingdom. The common people were disappointed, but they understood. Such was the king's prerogative. As for the knights, they mourned the loss of a tradition that had been a part of their code of conduct for so long. But the world was changing, and so were the times. Today, when we read about these medieval tournaments or watch them reenacted on television, we might chuckle at the absurdity of it all. We can't fathom why our ancestors spent so much time and energy on such frivolous pursuits. But then again, we live in different times, our entertainment is different, our problems seem more pressing. But if we look closely, if we peer into the depths of our fascination with violence in the media, we might just find a faint echo of those cheering crowds, the echo of a time when blood spilled in the arena was just another Tuesday. In medieval Europe, jousting tournaments were a regular occurrence. Knights from all over would come to participate in these events, which were held in special arenas called lists. The objective of a tournament was simple: to unhorse your opponent without getting yourself killed or seriously injured. Tournaments were a great way for knights to test their skills and also to earn some money. The winners of these events were usually showered with gifts and prizes. In some cases, the value of these gifts could be quite substantial. So it's no wonder that knights took these competitions very seriously. The rules of a joust were fairly simple, at least compared to the brutal battles that took place outside the arena. Each knight was given a certain amount of time to try and unhorse his opponent. If he failed to do so, then the other knight got a turn. The first knight to fall off his horse or to concede defeat lost the match. Sounds easy, right? Well, not exactly. These knights were armored head to toe, making it very difficult to move around. Their horses were also heavily armored and could weigh up to a ton. So imagine trying to maneuver a ton of angry horse while wearing a suit of metal. Not easy, I'm sure. Despite the danger involved, knights loved these tournaments. They were a chance to show off their skills and to win some prizes. Plus, they were a lot of fun. Can you imagine the sight of fully armored knights charging at each other on horseback? It must have been quite a sight to behold. But it wasn't just the knights who enjoyed these events. The common people loved watching these spectacles as well. For them, it was a chance to escape the monotony of everyday life. These tournaments were like the reality TV shows of the Middle Ages. People would come from all over to watch these events, and some would even camp out for days in order to get a good view of the action. And what about the horses? What happened to them after the battle? Well, most of them survived, at least the first few battles. But as the tournament progressed, things started to get more intense. And as the prize money increased, so did the determination of the knights. Soon, lances were shattering, swords were clashing, and horses were getting injured or even killed. Once a horse was out of the competition, it was usually sold to a farmer or a butcher. The farmers would use the horses for plowing fields or hauling goods, and the butchers, well, they took care of the rest. I hope you liked this episode. If you want to support us, please donate via the link below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. In the Middle Ages, a duel could be a fair fight between gentlemen or a brutal street fight. But for the nobility, it was also a political tool. So when two knights faced off, it wasn't just their reputations that were at stake, but often the balance of power across the kingdom. So how did medieval politics work? How did the duels influence the struggle for power? And what was the role of these seemingly meaningless fights in the great Game of Thrones? Let's find out. Part 10. Duel as Politics. If in many places duels were just cold-blooded justice or a pastime for the crowd, then in the hands of the powerful it was also a political weapon, where the sword cut not only into flesh but also into the reputation and prestige of the entire clan. Imagine a morning in a 15th century Burgundian palace. Beneath the high dome, the flags fluttering in the wind, the courtiers gather. The king sits on his throne. Before him are two knights, one from a prestigious house, the other from a rival noble branch. The reason given for this 1v1 battle seems simple: an insult, a disputed piece of land, or even a contemptuous glance at a banquet. But behind the scenes, everyone knows. This is a political drama, where blood will decide the balance of power. When the two men stepped into the arena, they brought more than just armor and swords. They also brought with them the honor of their families, the support of their factions, and the waiting eyes of the imperial court. Each strike was aimed not only at their opponents, but also at the forces behind them. The audience cheered, but the powerful watched in silence. Whoever fell today, their clan would lose power tomorrow. A victory could elevate a family from obscurity to the royal court. A defeat could bury an entire clan in disgrace. There were even cleverly arranged 1v1s. The king or lord knew which side was stronger, but still organized it to turn the death of a knight into a warning message. Do not challenge my authority. In those moments, the arena was like a political meeting, but the minutes were written in blood. It is said that there was a knight who, knowing for sure that he was being offered as a sacrificial lamb, was forced to step forward, not because he believed that God would protect him, but because refusing meant losing his honor forever. He chose death, so that at least his family could maintain some dignity. And that is the tragedy in the game of politics. There is no justice. There is only intrigue, trickery, and power dressed in honor. The crowd sees a dramatic fight. The king sees a powerful message. The knight, whether he wins or loses, is just a pawn on the grand chessboard. Looking back, it becomes clear. Medieval duels were not all about blood and steel, but also about the theater of calculations. There, a single lift of a sword could change the fate of a family. A single blow could turn the politics of a nation. And amid it all, the truth was a blur, drowned out by the cheers and the invisible hands pulling the strings. Now, let's see how the outcomes of these duels were decided. The outcome of a medieval duel was not just about skill and strength, but also about the right strategy and sometimes pure luck. The accepted way to end a duel was for one knight to agree to stop fighting, often by taking off his helmet and extending his sword in a gesture of submission. But as in any competition, there were different ways to win or lose. Sometimes a duel could end with both knights lying defeated on the ground, which led to a draw. In such cases, it was usually seen as a failure for both sides. However, sometimes this could also indicate a skillful draw, especially if one knight was clearly weaker. But regardless of the official outcome, there were situations where one knight simply could not continue the fight. This might have been due to injury, exhaustion, or possibly a trick by the opponent. In such cases, the knight had no choice but to submit or hope for mercy. But remember, in the Middle Ages, mercy was a rare guest. And now let's talk about weapons. What kind of weapons were used in medieval duels? Of course, the main thing here is to mention swords. They were the most popular weapon for duels among the nobility. Short swords for quick strikes and long swords for powerful blows. But there were also maces, clubs, daggers, and even poles, and some duels even allowed the use of firearms, although this was more common in the later Renaissance. The choice of weapon depended on the rules of the duel and the preferences of the knights, and as for armor, it was usually not as heavy as in battles. After all, a duel was not a big battle, but rather a test of skill and courage. To sum up, a medieval duel was not just a fight, it was a spectacle, a test of strength, and a political tool. There were unwritten rules, special weapons, and even strategies. The outcome of a duel could change the balance of power, decide the fate of families, and even turn the course of history. But behind the glitter of swords and armor, there was always a game of politics. A game where the stakes were high and the rules were as unpredictable as the whims of fate. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Also, we have other videos that you might enjoy. See you soon. Bye. Have you ever seen a magic trick? A magician takes an ordinary deck of cards, shuffles them in a seemingly random way, and then deals them out face up. You look at the cards and realize they're in order. Magician did it so quickly that you didn't have time to react. Such tricks impress us because they seem impossible, we think. How could I miss something like that? But if instead of a card trick, we had witnessed a trial in the 14th century, we might have felt the same way. Back then, people did not trust the power of logic and evidence. They relied on something they could not see or touch, their faith in God. Now, let me tell you about a case from that time. In the heart of Europe, a bustling city known for its trade fairs and skilled craftsmen, among the citizens, rumors spread like wildfire. Young Agnes is accused of betraying her husband. Her husband is a tanner, and without providing any evidence, Agnes claims that a local priest seduced her. The man was stunned. He did not know what to do. How could he prove his wife's words were false? There was only one way. At that time, it was common for a woman's loyalty to be tested in a special trial. It was called the trial of the holy water, or the floating test. The accused woman was stripped naked and tied up. Then she was thrown into a river. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty. In both cases, the outcome was certain. This test was based solely on the belief that God would not allow an innocent person to drown. Despite its apparent cruelty, the test was widespread. It may seem unbelievable now, but until the 18th century, such tests were used across Europe. But why? Why did people trust the water more than their own eyes and ears? They lived in a world where the rules we take for granted did not yet exist. If someone claimed something, there was no reliable way to prove or disprove it. For example, there were no cameras, so an eyewitness account was the primary source of evidence. But what guarantee did we have that the witness was telling the truth? And if there were no witnesses, how could you determine who was right? Without these basic principles, society could not function. Imagine living in a world without contracts, bank accounts, or even a watch. That's how it was back then. People needed some kind of external force to guide them, something stronger than their own opinions and assumptions. So they turned to God. For them, he was the ultimate authority, the unseen judge. Now let's go back to our story. So Agnes has passed her test. She either drowned or floated. No one knows because the chronicles have lost this detail. But whether she lived or died, no one could argue with the result. Agnes became a martyr, and that was enough. She was the victim of a cruel game where the rules were written by blind faith. What guarantees did we have that the water would show the truth? Maybe it was just a coincidence that Agnes survived. Or maybe the water didn't care about her fate. It was just water. But those people believed that everything happened for a reason. Now they had a choice. Abandon the rules of reason or follow the guidance of God. And they chose God. However, over time, doubts crept into this system. People began to wonder, what if the test failed? What if the innocent drowned or the guilty remained dry? Theologians pondered these questions for years. They made various adjustments to the rules, trying to make the trial fairer. But in essence, nothing changed. The decision was still based on faith, not evidence. Eventually such trials disappeared, but not because they became more accurate. No, they simply took on a different form. Today we can say that faith triumphed over law. People preferred to decide matters not by evidence and arguments but by relying on the power of God. In the Middle Ages, such trials were considered fair. It seems absurd to us today, but remember, they were the product of their time. In a world where everything was uncertain, faith was the only constant. It provided a framework of rules. However, flawed, it helped people live together. Do you believe in miracles? Do you trust your intuition, or do you prefer to rely on facts and evidence? In the end, we each choose what to believe in. If honor was the banner of the Middle Ages, then pride was the smoldering fire within, ready to burst into flames and consume reason. Many duels are not fought over justice or politics, but over invisible wounds, a contemptuous glance, an ironic remark, even an unintentional smirk. You know what they say about dueling cultures. They don't even need a reason to fight. A simple disagreement or difference of opinion can escalate into violence. Sometimes they fight to prove their strength, sometimes out of jealousy, sometimes out of arrogance. They fight to defend their honor. but often the reasons are so absurd that it makes one wonder if they have any reason at all. In the Middle Ages, that challenge could not be for knights. Pride was more important than life. They could lose their wealth and land, but they could not bear to be called cowards. You see, in medieval culture, a knight's pride was like a burning coal in his chest. If it went out, he would be considered a coward. He could lose everything: his status, his dignity, his life. But no matter how hard it was, a knight could not let his pride die out. But why were these men so obsessed with their own image? Why did they care so much about what others thought of them? Well, first of all, it was about self-respect. In medieval society, a man was respected for his courage and skills. A knight who backed down from a duel or refused to fight was seen as a coward. His reputation would be ruined, and he would lose the respect of his peers. Second, it was about loyalty. Knights were expected to defend their lord and their kingdom with their lives. To refuse to fight was seen as a betrayal of their duty. Third, it was about religion. The concept of the Holy War was prevalent in medieval Europe, and Christians were expected to fight against non-Christians to defend their faith. Of course, the Crusades are a good example of this. In addition, there was a strong belief in the warrior ethos which glorified violence and aggression. Knights were trained to be fearless and ruthless in battle. They were expected to fight with honor and courage, but also to be merciless towards their enemies. Lastly, it was about the thrill of the fight itself. Some knights simply enjoyed the excitement and the danger of combat. They loved the rush of adrenaline, the clash of swords, the cheers of the crowd. For many knights, fighting wasn't just a duty or a necessity. It was a way of life. But isn't all this quite ridiculous when we think about it now? Do we really need to resort to such extremes to defend ourselves? Today, we have laws and legal systems to protect us from harm. We have social norms and customs that dictate how we should behave. And yet, despite all this, we still find ourselves getting into arguments and fights with strangers. We take offense at the slightest provocation, and we're quick to anger and slow to forgive. It seems that human nature hasn't changed much after all. This obsession with honor led to countless deaths and maimings. Whole families were wiped out in the name of protecting their honor. Men, women, and children were killed just because they were related to someone who had been insulted. But you know what? It's not just medieval European men who were like this. Throughout history and around the world, there are examples of people who have done terrible things in the name of honor. From the ancient Greeks to the Japanese samurai, from the Bedouin tribesmen to the Victorian gentleman, the obsession with honor has been a constant feature of human society. You may be thinking that I'm exaggerating, but consider this. Even today, thousands of women are killed in the name of honor killings. Thousands of people are murdered every year because they have committed the unforgivable sin of falling in love with the wrong person. And it's not just happening in far-off lands. It's happening in our own communities, in our own cities. So what is the solution? How can we put an end to this madness? Well, maybe it starts with each of us. Maybe it begins with a simple act of empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. Maybe it requires a bit of courage, the willingness to stand up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. And maybe it needs a lot of education, the kind that teaches us to question our own biases and prejudices. The Middle Ages may be long gone, but the lessons they hold are timeless. In the medieval period, when men fought 1v1 battles, there were only two outcomes. One would walk away from the clash with cheers echoing around him, while the other would find his demise in a pool of blood. However, history doesn't always side with the victors. Sometimes it's the fallen who create the most lasting impact. While the victors basked in their triumphs, their names written down in the annals of history as symbols of their prowess, their opponents didn't just fade into oblivion. Their stories, too, resonated through time, leaving behind questions, doubts, and sometimes even a sense of tragedy. In the grand theater of medieval combat, there were two types of survivors. Those who emerged victorious carried with them not just the laurels of triumph, but also a burden. Every victory had a cost, measured in the blood spilled, lives taken, and scars left both on the body and soul. The true victors were those who understood this, those who could navigate the complexities of war and politics, turning a single battle into a stepping stone for their legacy. Men like William Marshal, whose name echoed through the ages, a testament to his skill and honor, or Jean de Carouge, whose victory in a French duel became a legendary tale, a testament to his unwavering spirit. Their names are synonymous with victory, their strategies and tactics studied, their duels spoken of around campfires. They were the paragons of knighthood, their victories shaping not just their destinies, but also the perception of what it meant to be a warrior in that era. But then there were others, those whose losses became a string of endless tales. These were men like Jacques Legris, whose fate was sealed in that very same French duel that brought fame to Carouge. Legris, despite his noble birth and valiant efforts, was declared a traitor and met his end at the tip of Carouge's sword. But history hasn't been kind to Carouge alone. Legris's name has also echoed through time, not as a loser but as a symbol of possible injustice, an emblem of how even the noblest could fall. His story raises questions about the nature of honor, the objectivity of justice, and the vagaries of fate in a medieval world where both could turn on a dime. Then there were those knights whose defeats became epic tragedies. They stood against insurmountable odds. their battles less about winning and more about displaying unparalleled bravery and tenacity. Even in the face of certain defeat, their valor became a thing of legend, their names whispered with a mix of admiration and sorrow. To lose with such grace, to stand tall even when victory was impossible, that too became a form of triumph. Their deeds, though ending in defeat, were seen as a model of how to face one's mortality with dignity, how to lose without dishonor. In the grand tapestry of medieval history, these fallen knights are not just threads in the background, but vibrant patterns that add depth and meaning to the entire design. Their stories, passed down through generations, served as cautionary tales, reminders of the heavy cost of victory and the somber weight of defeat. But perhaps their most significant role was in shaping the character of medieval society. These fallen knights, with their tales of bravery, tenacity, and tragic loss, became the stuff of legends, the foundation on which the ideals of knighthood, loyalty, and sacrifice were built. It's a stark reminder that in the brutal reality of medieval combat, no one truly wins. At best, one walks away bearing the scars of victory or the mantle of defeat. But either way, one thing is certain: their place in history is secure. And here's a question for you. Who do you think deserves more remembrance, the victors or the vanquished? Let your voice be heard in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to stay tuned for more tales of valor, defeat, and everything in between. Until next time, remember, on the field of combat, as in life, it's not just about who wins, but also about how they win and why. From the endless discussions about the greatest warriors to the debates about historical duels, here's what we can tell you for sure. In those days, there was no shortage of people ready to prove their strength and superiority in battle. There were quite a few people who went down in history precisely because of the fights that they picked. The most important thing is not to forget that behind the stories of real heroes, there are stories of ordinary people with their hobbies and habits. Our story today is also about the clash of such individuals. The story of how a bet for a piece of bacon led to a murderous duel. Medieval life was not easy, and there were very few opportunities to just sit back and relax. That's why even peasants tried to snatch a minute of rest when they could. This happened in the town of St. Paul de Varadin, which at that time was still called Courageous. One ordinary morning, after a hard day's work, two farmers decided to treat themselves to a good meal. Their names were Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris. When the two friends met in the market, they decided to go to the tavern together. Sitting over a mug of ale, the conversation turned to women. According to the recollections of the witnesses, Jean de Carouge claimed that he knew how to get a woman to smile at him no matter what. Jacques Legris doubted this. Then Courageous confidently stated that he would show them tomorrow. The next day, as promised, Courageous came to the square in front of the tavern at noon, confident that he would easily seduce a young woman named Isabeau de Clemenceau. However, it turned out that in this endeavor, the man was helped not by his skills but by a piece of bacon. When the lady entered the square, the persistent suitor handed her the crispy slice of meat. Amused by this unusual courtship, the girl took the bacon and said that she would meet with him tomorrow. While Courageous was beside himself with joy, Jacques Legris was not at all happy with what had happened. He told the arrogant friend that he had offended him. He didn't deny it, only deepened the conflict. Friends couldn't reconcile. Moreover, in the heat of the moment, they began to argue so violently that soon it was already impossible to find common ground. A quarrel broke out between them. As a result of the brawl, both men were injured. Perhaps it would have ended there if it wasn't for the fact that after the tavern closed, the insulted Legris found Courageous at home and demanded satisfaction for the insult. And then the fateful toast was made. In order to end the conflict, it was proposed to seal the peace treaty with a glass of wine. But instead of drinking for peace, Jacques Legris poured wine on Jean de Carouge. After that, a furious fight broke out again. The fighters did not notice how they knocked down the cross that stood right next to the house and severed the head from its base. However, they soon noticed their destructive activity. Then they decided to stop the fight and leave. This was probably one of the most stupidest episodes in the history of duels, because after that, everyone went to bed. No one saw the bloody mess in the street anymore. However, in the morning, the townspeople got a chance to see the torn clothes of the two former friends, as well as weapons that lay around them. Soon, the city council received complaints from different people about yesterday's fight. People wanted to see the guilty punished, but the offenders themselves did not want to admit their guilt. They simply claimed that they had nothing to do with this. It was difficult to prove otherwise, since there were no witnesses of the incident. Plus, both were influential people in the city. While the investigation was ongoing, a rumor spread among the townspeople. Many people believed that the fight was caused by a woman. However, even the investigators had no way of knowing this. Both accused remained adamant, refusing to admit their guilt. Perhaps the matter would have been forgotten if not for the intervention of Bishop Oliver de Terran. He was able to persuade the accused that it was necessary to end the conflict. The bishop called both to his home, gave them communion, and instructed them to forgive each other. Of course, they had to promise to never have a fight again. Only then could they get forgiveness for their sins. But this plan didn't work. Having entered the church, Jean de Carouge declared loudly, "I am ready to forgive him if he admits his guilt." However, Legris categorically refused to admit his fault. In response, the bishop suggested that they solve everything according to the laws of the Middle Ages, and then the two sworn enemies signed an agreement. It obliged them to engage in a duel. This custom was widespread throughout Europe. Moreover, in some kingdoms, the results of such fights were recognized as true by the court. Unfortunately, the documents detailing the rules of these trials did not survive. However, it is known that the duel could be preceded by a lengthy process. In some cases, it lasted several months. During this time, the accused had to provide guarantees that he was innocent. It was also necessary to determine the witnesses of the crime. If they suddenly changed their testimony, the accused could be deprived of support. However, even if all the witnesses spoke convincingly about the guilt of the accused, he could still avoid answering with weapons in his hands. To do this, he had to pay a large sum of money. This amount was usually transferred to the treasury of the monastery. In addition, one of the accused could invoke the protection of a higher feudal lord. When all preparations were completed, the fighters had to appear before the judge. Only after that could the verdict be announced. This is exactly what happened with our heroes. The enraged priest pronounced a sentence that sounded like a death sentence for both parties. The duel was scheduled for Sunday. At dawn, the whole town got up to watch the performance. The square in front of the church was chosen as the site of the battle. It is believed that it was here that the quarrel had broken out. The rules of the duel were simple. Each fighter chose a second. In addition, the judge and 4 assistants who were supposed to separate the fighters in case of a draw were present. The accused was tied up with a special belt in case he wanted to flee. The rope held his hands behind his back. The purpose of the duel was to inflict a deadly wound. It was allowed to use any weapon. The outcome of the duel was obvious. First, the fight would definitely not end in a draw. Second, since both accused were guilty, they would not receive any protection from the church. So one of them was clearly destined to die. During the fight, Jean de Carouge inflicted several serious wounds on his opponent. However, Legris managed to deliver the final blow. He stabbed his opponent in the neck. Then both opponents removed their masks, and it turned out that Jacques Legris had killed not only his sworn enemy, but also his own brother. Realizing what had happened, he immediately regretted it. However, there was no turning back. Immediately after the fight, the dead man's brother accused the murderer of murder and demanded revenge. Legris had no choice but to agree to another fight. Fortunately, this time the confrontation did not end fatally. After the fight, the brothers were buried in the same coffin. As for the surviving duelist, he realized too late that he had killed an innocent person. Full of remorse, he voluntarily went to the monastery and spent the rest of his life there, praying for the forgiveness of his sins. The story of these people is a prime example of what the consequences of a violent society could be. In medieval culture, violence was considered a natural way to resolve conflicts. However, it often led to sad consequences. For example, the story of the Swiss knight Hanswald von Erloff in 1378. He had a fight with Ludwig von Hollenberg. The two nobles argued over a woman. During the duel, Hans managed to kill his opponent, but soon he himself became the victim of retribution. A year later, he was killed by Ludwig's brother. And if you want to learn more about how people used to arrange fights in the Middle Ages, watch our video, Naked Knight, the history of the strangest duels. We wish you to always and everywhere choose peaceful methods of resolving conflicts. And don't forget to subscribe.